I was a 19-year-old female at the time. Still female, of course, just a little older now. I love camping. Anytime my friends and I came home from college, we would load up a cooler with beer, grab some gear, and head out to the woods. Unfortunately, when I was at school, none of my sorority sisters or other friends ever wanted to go with me, so I would often suffer withdrawals from camping. One day, the weather was way too nice to waste, so I grabbed some of my gear, borrowed a car from a buddy, and drove to a spot that was secluded, yet within a safe distance from civilization, in case I needed help. Camping sometimes creeps me out, but that creepy feeling is also part of the fun. It's the same reason people read scary stories. It's thrilling to be scared. I set up a little camp and got a fire going. I hadn't brought much to eat, but I was enjoying myself, reading and exploring the area, that sort of thing. At one point, I got the feeling I was being watched and stopped dead in my tracks. I heard a twig crunch to my right and saw a doe bolt from about 100 feet in front of me. I laughed at myself and went back to camp with the armful of wood I had gathered. I kept freaking myself out, hearing sounds just outside the ring of light cast by the fire. I always get inside my head, so I shrugged it off and continued whittling at a stick I had been messing with. Around 1, I decided to go into my tent and snuff out the lantern. I had been slamming beers in the most unladylike fashion and smoking cheap cigars, another reason I love camping. I can act however I want. So I passed out relatively quickly. At around 2 a.m., I started hearing footsteps. They sounded pretty light and sort of timid. I thought to myself that it was probably a deer or another animal, more likely a raccoon since I had probably left some food out. Still, I stayed on guard. After about 30 minutes of sleeping with one eye open, I heard a rubbing noise, and the tent fabric was being pushed in a bit. I don't know how I didn't soil my sleeping bag, but I just sat there, paralyzed, with my K-bar knife in my hand. I desperately wanted to thrust the knife through the tent fabric, but I was still holding out hope that it was some of my buddies from a frat playing a joke on me. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. I started to feel slightly more secure, knowing daylight would be coming in about 2 or 3 hours, but I was sure as hell not going to go to sleep. Suddenly, around 4 a.m., I realized I should put my boots on so that if anything did happen, I would be ready. After staying up and remaining alert for a little while longer, my friend's car alarm went off, blaring. I freaked the hell out and ran out of the tent. I got about 2 steps before something grabbed me around the mouth. I opened my mouth to scream, but instead the person's pinky finger slipped between my teeth. I've heard that people can perform superhuman feats when they have a huge adrenaline rush. In my case, I just clamped down, and, there's no way to say this without sounding ridiculous, his finger popped off. He screamed, pulled his hand away, and the missing digit fell to the ground. He took off running down the hill I was camping on, and I took off in the opposite direction. I must have looked ridiculous to the people whose house I ran to. A little sorority girl in a wife-beater, boxers, and steel-toe boots. I also had some blood that had oozed out of my lip, not from the finger, but because I had also managed to take a pretty good chunk out of my own lip. I told them what happened. They called the police, got me some real clothing, and the man of the house made me a whiskey and Coke. When the cops arrived, they went to check out the campsite. By the time they came back, it was light out. They brought me back so I could get my friend's car, and what I saw made me even more scared. Right next to the tent was a red gas can. He could have lit me on fire earlier. The finger was also gone, suggesting he had come back. The kicker is, they never caught the guy. So somewhere out there is a man sitting down to dinner, maybe alone, maybe with a wife and a couple of kids, and he's missing his right pinky. My girlfriend at the time and I were on a backpacking trip through northern Vermont, 10 days of hiking and camping in the great outdoors. We were carrying everything we needed for the entire trip, food, supplies, etc., and weren't planning on leaving the trail at all. I've been doing outdoor activities my entire life and feel very comfortable on trips like this. My girlfriend had done a decent amount of hiking and camping, but she had never been on a trip this long. Honestly, I was totally psyched to have a girlfriend interested in this sort of thing. My previous girlfriends had been good for a day hike, but that's about it. Anyway, the woods, and more importantly, the weather were beautiful, and everything on our trip was going great. Our routine was pretty simple. We'd hike around 15 miles during the day, and then, when it started to get a bit dark, we'd hike off the trail into the woods a few hundred yards or so, and find a nice flat place to set up our tent for the night. It's always surprising to me how alone you can be out in the woods. The first few days, we saw maybe 3 or 4 other hikers each day, usually just walking by us in the opposite direction. By the 4th day, we had stopped seeing other hikers altogether. This was because we had hiked farther north into a more secluded area that gets a lot less foot traffic. So it's the 7th night, and we haven't seen anyone else for probably 3 or 4 days at this point. I fall asleep and wake up very early, as I always do while camping. Typically, I would just lie in my sleeping bag waiting for my girlfriend to wake up. But while I was lying there, I heard a noise outside our tent. Something was walking around. We were pretty close to the edge of a river or lake, and I was excited, thinking that I might get to see a moose. I got out of the tent as quietly as I could. It was still dark out. The sun wasn't up yet, but my eyes were used to the low light. I scanned around for a moose or another animal, but didn't see anything. Eventually, though, I noticed some movement. There was a man standing about 100 feet from our tent. As I watched, he turned and walked into the woods. You know that feeling you get on a roller coaster when everything drops out from under you? I had that exact same feeling. I was out in the woods and had no idea what to do. A lot of possibilities were racing through my head. Was he a hunter or a random camper who just stumbled on our tent? If so, why was he out so early in the morning? The sun wasn't even up yet. I checked my watch. 4 a.m. If he wasn't a hunter, then were we unintentionally on his property? Was he pissed? Why didn't he say anything? I was having trouble coming up with explanations that made sense and weren't just completely terrifying. What was this guy's deal? I ended up getting my girlfriend up a lot earlier than usual, and we hiked a lot of extra miles that day. I had no idea if this guy was following us or what. I spent all day looking over my shoulder, expecting 100% to see him every single time, coming up from behind. Of course, nothing happened, and we finished the trip safely. The vision of this guy walking off into the shadowy woods is still completely etched in my mind years later. Back in 2011, I was part of a group of friends who had a tradition of camping at a particular spot every May long weekend. The spot we chose was in a beautiful area right on the edge of a large lake located on government land. The lake had a dam on it, so during May, the water levels were always low, if not completely empty, making it possible to walk across it. People were allowed to camp there as long as they weren't causing trouble or making a mess, and it was generally a good time for everyone. The campsites were spaced far enough apart to offer privacy, but not so far that you couldn't meet other people. That year, our spot was in the middle of a small hill, with one campsite below us and one above us. The first night of our trip passed without incident. On the second day, the people staying at the site below us moved in. We didn't think much of it and continued drinking throughout the day and into the night. Around midnight, however, the people at the campsite below us became really out of control. They were yelling and screaming, and their music had gotten even louder, so our friend Ben went down to ask them to turn it down. He was promptly punched in the face, and he came back to inform us that he was 90% sure they were on drugs. After that, the vibe wasn't as relaxed, and we were all somewhat on edge. I was feeling really tired, so I decided to go to bed. Some of my friends were still awake, including Ben, and one couple, Lily and Derek, who were visiting another campsite we had made friends with earlier that day. I could still hear the campsite below blasting their music and partying hard, but I just tried to ignore it and go to sleep. I don't know what time it was when I was jolted awake. Parts of this are somewhat of a blur. All I know is that I sat straight up as soon as I heard the screaming and yelling coming from outside my tent. I quickly ran outside to find our campsite in chaos. One of my friends was clutching their chest, people were running around, and others were screaming to call 911. I was quickly informed of what had happened. Apparently, not long after I had gone to bed, the people camping at the site below us decided they weren't finished talking to Ben. On their way up, they encountered Lily and Derek walking back. Now Derek and Ben are about the same height and have the same color hair, so they assumed that Derek was Ben and hit both him and Lily over the head with a full glass bottle. I don't know if it was the same guys who showed up at our campsite, but I was told that everyone else was sitting around the fire when 2 or 3 huge guys appeared from the darkness and walked over to them. One had a paring knife, and the other had a butcher's knife in their hands. Ben saw the knives and got up to talk to them, but he had barely spoken a word when the guy with the paring knife stabbed him once in the chest. At the same time, some people from the campsite above had seen the guys coming and came down to help. One of those guys, Tim, was coming down the hill when the guy with the butcher's knife ran up to him and stabbed him in the stomach. From there, sheer panic ensued. People called 911, but the ambulance was over a half hour away. This is when I came out of the tent. Tim's wound was bleeding profusely, and he was losing blood way too quickly. His friends ended up putting him in the back of their car and speeding off to meet the ambulance halfway. Ben was also bleeding, but his wound wasn't as deep as Tim's, and we were able to keep him calm until an ambulance arrived. The guys with the knives ran off into the darkness, back down to their campsite, and took off in their Land Rover. My boyfriend at the time and I got into his car and drove to the entrance to try and flag down the policemen on their way to the scene. Once they arrived, we were informed to stay in the car, as they had released a canine search unit to hunt down the people who had stabbed our friends. By the end of the night, they had arrested the men. They had tried to flee by driving their vehicle across the lake bed, where they got stuck in a muddy section. They were on a concoction of several drugs, as suspected. Luckily, both Tim and Ben survived, although Tim had lost a lot of blood and took a few weeks to recover from his wounds. Derek and Lily had huge goose eggs, and possibly one of them had a concussion, though I can't recall. It was definitely the scariest thing I have ever experienced, and a few of us had to testify against them in court. In May 2009, I had just broken up with my girlfriend of almost 3 years. We had moved from Calgary to Toronto and were still stuck living together after the breakup, as we didn't know many people in the city yet. Needless to say, the situation was pretty stressful and upsetting. So when a buddy I was going to school with at the time suggested a weekend camping and fishing trip, I jumped at the chance. He grew up in an area about an hour outside of Toronto called Flamborough. It's really beautiful, with loads of lush forests, farmers' fields, and small rivers and creeks. We decided to camp and fish along a creek called Grindstone Creek. It's close to some wetlands, and the fishing is supposed to be great. We ended up setting up our camp in what was probably a farmer's field. I'm guessing we were trespassing, bordered by a gorgeous forest. We spent the evening fishing, shooting the breeze, and drinking some quality craft beers. As it got darker, we made a little fire and roasted potatoes and hot dogs. All in all, it was a really good night. We turned in just after midnight, sharing a tent. My buddy fell asleep before me, and I stayed up playing on my phone until probably around 1:30. I must have drifted off, because the next thing I remember was being woken up by a high-pitched yipping noise. I was kind of groggy, and it took me a moment to fully wake up. The yipping was incessant, and it sounded like a weird coyote. I lay there for a moment listening, and then started playing on my phone again. The noise was annoying as hell. I tried ignoring it, but it sounded like it was getting closer. Finally, it sounded like it had to be no more than 10 feet from the tent. At this point, I was getting a little unsettled. I had seen coyotes in Calgary before and thought of them as pretty harmless. They never looked much bigger than a smallish dog. But what if this one was rabid or something? What if it could smell our food? I have a pretty bad anxiety disorder, so I'm prone to worrying about these types of things. I nudged my buddy to see if he was awake, and he was. The noise had woken him up too. We discussed what to do about the coyote, as we hadn't brought anything to scare off critters. Not even a BB gun, nothing. Finally, he decided he would shine the flashlight on it and holler, hoping to scare it off. He unzipped the tent, and I watched him point the flashlight out into the darkness. I'll never forget what happened next. His legs suddenly went all wobbly, and he sort of stumbled backward into the tent. He had a really dumbfounded look on his face when he looked at me and babbled, "It's not a coyote. It's a dude. It's some weird dude." Normally, I would have thought he was messing with me. I'm a huge wimp and scare easily. I won't even watch horror movies. But I've never seen someone look that scared, and I never want to see that expression on someone's face again. So I knew he wasn't pulling my leg. The weird yipping and howling noises were still going on, and in retrospect, it really didn't sound like a coyote. I guess in our groggy states, that was just how our brains tried to make sense of it. Anyway, he kept telling me to look out the tent flap to make sure he wasn't crazy. At this point, I was having a full-blown anxiety attack. My heart was racing, and I felt like crap, but I had to look. So I slowly peeked out the flap and waited for my eyes to adjust. And that's when I saw him. He was standing only a few arms lengths away from the tent. He was swaying a little and wearing a baseball cap. What made it awful, though, what was really creepy, was that he was wearing women's lingerie. That's when I knew there was most likely something very wrong with this guy. If making high-pitched noises at a stranger's tent in the middle of the night didn't already give it away. After I pulled my head back inside the tent, my buddy and I discussed what to do. Finally, we decided to yell at the guy to fuck off. My buddy started yelling, "Excuse me, can you fuck off? We're trying to sleep in here." The noise stopped, and it was dead silent. That's when we heard footsteps running toward our tent. They stopped right outside the tent, but we didn't waste any time. We started yelling again, "Seriously, fuck off. We have cell phones in here. If you don't fuck off, we're going to call the cops." With that, we heard him walk by the tent and head off. It sounded like he was moving toward the road. Needless to say, we lay awake, petrified, until the first sign of sunlight. Then we hightailed it the hell out of there. We discussed our experience on the way home, and were both pretty embarrassed about how scared we got. It definitely was not manly on either of our parts. I think because we were both ashamed of how we let some weirdo freak us out so much, we really haven't talked about it since that day. So there you go. There's my weird story. I'll always wonder what the hell that guy was doing out there, or what was wrong with him. Sometimes I wonder if things would have turned out differently if we were a couple of girls. I'm not saying he was some serial killer, but it seemed like he was testing who was in the tent. I guess I'll never know. And for that, I'm kind of glad.